Salutations. Um, this one's a bit late. Certainly later than I intended it to be. And for that, I apologize. First half of March and all of February were both very busy for me. And so I didn't have nearly as much time to read as I wanted to. And so I only really got to Salamandastron on the Ides, but I did finish it. And I enjoyed it so greatly that if you look in the description, you'll see it is number one in the rankings. I'll get to why in a bit. But first, I want to shout out Wholesome Bookworm, who has been making his own way through the Redwall series and doing his own review of each book. He's gotten videos out on both Redwall and Mossflower, and I suggest you check them out. His content is a little shorter form than mine, but we both have that sort of rambling from notes style, which I'm somewhat fond of, but I wish I could. I do feel like I could shorten things up a bit. Salamandastron, I took a lot of notes on, though. It impressed me. I'm going to go through a couple of general notes before I go on to the specifics and the plot summary. Big things. Jakes is known for his use of food, and Salamandastron is no exception. However, Salamandastron is a little tonally darker than some of the previous entries, at least for some of it. And for sizable portions of the book, Jakes's food descriptions are sparse, Spartan even. They're not as lavish or as great and sumptuous, and that fits the tone, I think. And he does, and towards the end, when there is a great feast, he does pull out all the stops, and it feels really good. And there's a point in the middle where he pulls out some of the stops, and he gets us a good solid meal, and it feels really nice. But he is a lot more sparing with the food descriptions than in some of the previous books, and I appreciate that. The other sort of general note is that the fights in this book, and there are several, have really taken a step up. Jake's fights have already been decent, but these ones like whole new level. I'd especially like to note Sam Kim versus what was his name? Deathbrush. Sam Kim versus Deathbrush. Deathbrush isn't a particularly important character, but Sam Kim's battle with him is a very, very awesome fight. And Jakes sets it up and frames it perfectly. That and the fight that occurs like immediately after in the same scene are both very good. The final battle at Salamandastron is really good. It spans multiple chapters, and like every part just feels really, really strong. Um, and like just in general, Salamandastron's fights, I think, while none of Jake's fights have been bad, I think they've all been good. There are a couple of fights in here that I actually consider great. Really only challenged by, say, Matthias's fights against Asmodeus or Clooney in the first Redwall, which were a little less stylistically powerful. They were a little more basic, but they were so well tied into the emotional arc of the story that I felt they worked really well. These both fit into the arc of the story and are very, very well technically executed. So, very pleased with those. Speaking of narrative structure, this is a bit of an odd one. Jakes is playing with us here. He is playing with some interesting new ideas. There are two characters who are clearly identifiable as protagonist. This is the second book to name a location rather than a particular person. Mossflower was named like that, but Redwall, Mattimeo, and Mariel were all named after. Well, no, Redwall's a place. Yeah. But Mariel and Mattimeo were both named after characters. And so we're back to sort of the place naming scheme, and I kind of like that. Redwall had one very clear protagonist in Matthias. Mossflower had a very clear protagonist in Martin, even though there were some other, pretty major characters. Mattimeo had, I'd say Mattimeo as the protagonist, though Martin and Slagar both certainly played prominent roles. You had that sort of split chase narrative, and that worked really well. Mariel, it was slightly less clear, but I think it's pretty obvious that Mariel was the protagonist, even though it was a little unclear which of Mariel and Dandon were the Abbey warrior, or if they both were. That was always a little odd. With this, we have a clear Abbey warrior, but we also have another character who I would consider equally a protagonist, but is not the Abbey warrior, but is attached to the Abbey in a bit of a roundabout way. There are four sort of main plot lines, and I guess it would be easier to just start from the beginning with the plot summary. The book opens with a scene in a cave where Farago the assassin, a weasel war chief, has just murdered a pair of badgers. And there are two badger cubs, one striped, the other unstriped, that he decides to simply leave. And of course, this is one of the classic blunders. Never leave the children of your enemies alive, because they will come back to bite you, quite literally sometimes. And that certainly plays into things. We then fast forward to many years in the future. The Badger Lord of Salamandastron is the mighty Earthstripe, and he has an adopted daughter, Mara, Badger Maid, who is not happy at the mountain. She doesn't like the strictness of her father. She doesn't. She feels that she is constrained and lacks freedom. And so, and she has a hare who is one of the younger hares, and her steadfast companion, that is Pickle Folger. His last name is spelled Ffolger, which I absolutely love. I love that double F. It is such a fun little thing to have in names. Doesn't make all that much of a difference, but Folger is a great character, and the double F, I think, actually helps it rather than just being Folger. The best part of waking up, as it were. There are a lot. There are a lot of great names in this one, as I'm sure you'll hear in a bit. But Mara and Pickle, Pickle more or less runs along with Mara. Mara is unhappy at the mountain, and so she will frequently go on, extended walks before returning when, she starts running out of food. And Pickle will follow her on those and eat half the food because he's a hare. And at one point on one of these walks, they meet a pair of young vermin. I believe a weasel and think off as a stoat. I forget. And they end up taking them back to the mountain because the vermin managed to convince them that they just wander and do as they wish. And that doesn't go too well. Earthstripe tolerates them briefly before kicking them out the next morning. Mara and Pickle decide to go chase after them and join them on their sort of freebooting and fun adventure lifestyle. But it turns out that the vermin are not, in fact, just random wanderers. They are, in fact, soldiers. One of them is, in fact, the son of Farago the assassin, and the other is basically the son's bodyguard. And so Klitsch, son of Farago, and Gotha more or less interrogate Mara and Pickle about the mountain and the supposed Great Badger treasure, because Farago has his eyes on conquering the mountain, and they're trying to get information. Um, and that starts one plot line. Really, it starts two of the plot lines, but I'll get back to it in just a second. Meanwhile, at Redwall Abbey, um, the young squirrel Samkim is a rather energetic fellow. He has a habit of shooting his bow indoors and in other places where he's not supposed to shoot his bow. And the young mole maid Arula tends to encourage him in these activities, much to the displeasure of the elders of the abbey. Redwall also has a bit of a problem. They don't have a badger mum to watch over the abbey. The great chair that various badgers have sat in over the years is empty. And timeline wise, we're actually like almost directly after Mariel. Abbot Saxtus grew to a wise old age, but eventually was he either retired or was died, and Abbess Vale is now in command of the abbey. And of course, we have the Joseph Bell ringing out, and Samkim has this sort of wanderlust, and there is and at the abbey, a couple of mud-covered, I think they're a Stoughton affair, I forget which. There are a couple of mud-covered vermin show up at the door, Ding-Eye and Thura. They're clearly miserable, clearly harmless, and so the Redwallers more or less, invite them in on condition that they get baths and behave themselves. These two, Ding-Eye and Thura, are deserters of Farago's army. And they don't really know it, but they're being chased by some of Farago's hunters, which comes up much later. And they join the feast. They're amazed by the food. They eat too much and have to be given a medicine, which tastes foul, of course, as most medicines do. But they get along famously with Samkim and Arula. And it rains, and they've got to pull the sports equipment in, and that's sort of a minor thing. But that's what's happening at the Abbey. Back at Salamandastron, Earthstripe sends two of his hares, Sapwood and Big Oxeye. Sergeant Sapwood and Big Oxeye, who run out to keep an eye on the youngsters and make sure they get back safe. The hares realize that there's an army, run in to rescue Mara and Pickle before things get too hairy. Sapwood gets himself wounded. Oxeye distracts the vermin horde, and Mara and Pickle run off in the middle of a rainstorm. And this is where the paths of Salamandastron and Mara and Pickle start to diverge. We've now got sort of three lines. Well, we're about to get a fourth. At the Abbey, the next morning, Ding-Eye and Thura get up pretty much before anyone else, find the bows, and start fooling around with them in the hall. Now, the night before, during the feast, Sister Nasturtium had sung some very strange song that, as the reader, we can tell comes from Martin the Warrior, and is, of course, prophetic. And it mentions a particular place, and the Abbey recorder goes to research it, and he works through the night to find it. Um, no, wait, I'm missing something. Ah, right. So that night, the night before when it was raining, Samkin almost gets struck by lightning because lightning strikes the Abbey roof, and the Sword of Martin falls off the roof and into the battlements, and Samkin drags it inside, and that's what the the recorder was looking up, um, and he finds the information about it, and he's very excited, and he comes out. But as he comes out, one of the vermin who they're playing with the bows that were used for the sporting event, and one of them shoots it into the air, and as it comes down, it strikes the recorder in the neck, and he falls down. And the bow lands with a clatter. The rodents realize that something is very bad, that they're not going to be able to stay. So they take the Sword of Martin off the body of the poor recorder, and they run out and they sneak out. And then Samkin comes down the stairs, sees what's happened, picks up the bow, and that's when he's caught by the cook. And so things go very poorly for a bit. Mara and Pickle, in the meantime, have found themselves trapped by frogs, and they're down a pit, and they meet some shrews in the pit. The hares report back to Salamandastron. Nobody knows where Mara and Pickle are, and that's rather worrying. But they've got a bigger issue. They've got a army of several thousand vermin coming to attack the mountain, and so they start fortifying, as one should. Ding Ai and Thura run off into the wilderness. Samkim is confined to the infirmary while the investigation takes place. They eventually figure out that Samkim didn't do it, but by that point, Samkim and Arula have escaped, and they've left the Abbey to go and chase the Ding Ai and Thura and get back the Sword of Martin. And Abbotsvale asks, well, shouldn't we send someone after them? And one of the others say, no, I think they've got the Spirit of Martin with them. They'll be fine. Which is a very Redwall sort of excuse. And so they start chasing after the vermin with the sword. Mara and Pickle meet some shrews in the pit beneath the frogs. The shrews basically reveal that they're from the guerrilla union of South Stream shrews in Mossflower, or of Mossflower, I forget which is the Goosum. It's with 3 S's. Goosum with 3 S's, which is it's kind of amusing to read, especially after we're used to Gausum being the much shorter version. But they end up the other shrews show up on a rescue mission. Mara manages to irritate some of the frogs so they fall down, and she grabs their trident and she climbs out. And then the shrews throw the king frog down the pit after rescuing all the shrews from it. They throw the king frog down, and then they throw a pike in after the king frog, as in the big fish. And so the king frog, who is a rather nasty character, meets a rather fitting end. And Mara doesn't have to actually spill any blood, which is probably a good thing. But now Mara and Pickle are with the shrews. They, go with the shrews. One of the, I think it's Thura, falls ill as they're running away, and he feels unwell, and so the other one, Ding Ai, leaves Thura behind and keeps going. And this whole time they're chopping plants up with the sword so they can make it through Mossflower wood. And Sam, Kim, and Arula are following, and they meet an old hermit named Fergal. And Fergal is the least necessary character in the story. Jake's has a tendency to have characters who don't do much and have minimal purpose. Um, and he has this tendency to have, interesting, fun side characters. The interesting, fun side characters are appreciated, like Bobo and Mariel. Bobo was a great character. He had the little newt. He had his, place by the sea, and that was really cool. Fergal is this old hermit who exists only for exposition, and that saddens me. Um, I think there are really only two things holding this book back. One is exposition, and the other is something I'll get to in a little bit. Um, but as you can see, we've got the makings of a decent story here. Sam, Kim, and Arula meet Fergal. Then Fergal runs off to Redwall after telling them about the corpse of the um, uh, corpse of the vermin. And then so they keep following the trail. Um, and back at the mountain, fortifications continue, and Farago, shows up with his army and starts, setting up camp. And of course, he's using all the tricks, like everyone carrying, two or three torches to make their host appear even bigger than it is. And the hares, of course, are seasoned campaigners and know the trick, and thus can calculate accurately how many forces Farago actually has. It's still like 40 against 4,000, if I remember the um, descriptions right. And there's some rounds of parleying and some skirmishes. Um, the Mara and Pickle end up at the big shrew cave. When there's a great feast there, and Pickle ends up in a pudding eating contest against a shrew named Tubgut, who's described as being very fat, and so it's very amusing. And he absolutely trounces the poor shrew because he's a hare, and even the greatest shrew cannot beat even the most ascetic of hares. And I don't think there's a single hare who's ever, really fasted. Um, at least voluntarily. Let me think. I'm trying to remember where things go next. Mara and Samkim and Arula end up um, attacked by bees when they sit down to lunch and pull out their scones with jam, and they are rescued by a fellow named, oh darn, I've already forgotten his name. That's absolutely terrible of me. Spriggett. Spriggett is a hedgehog. I do think Spriggett and Fergal could have been combined if Spriggett had been introduced a little earlier, or Fergal had just been removed entirely. By the way, Fergal arrives at Redwall right as one of them is starting to fall ill. And soon the whole abbey is down with dry ditch fever. And according to the old legends, the only way to get rid of dry ditch fever is ice tor flowers from the far north boiled in spring water. And this is where the problems begin. An otter known as Thrug volunteers to run off and retrieve the flowers of Istor. He has no clue what they look like, but he's pretty sure he'll know what they look like when he finds them. And so he sets off. And after him sneaks Baby Dumble, a baby mouse, who manages to catch up to Thrug, though he gets caught by a snake, and Thrug has to bonk the snake on the head. And then Dumble rides in Thrug's haversack all the way up to the north. And it's very amusing. And get back to them in a minute. But Mara and Pickle want to go back to Salamandastron. but and they want the shrews to come and help them because they realize that a big army of shrews will help against Farago's army, who's almost certainly attacking the mountain. But Logalog says, and there's always a Logalog, of course. Logalog says that to for that to work, there's some troubles at home. He'll do that, but they've got to help him first, and so he takes them on an expedition to go retrieve the Black Stone, the symbol of authority among the South Stream shrews, which is an absolute tongue twister still. And so that adventure starts. And meanwhile, the Farago's trackers have caught up to the remaining Stoat. They kill him and take the sword. And Deathrush is annoyed because he wanted to have both of them, or at least both their heads, but he can't. And so he just decides to take the sword as an appeasement to Farago. Farago, by the way, is actually framed really darn well. He is consistently shown to be willing to be brutal, but also smart. There are several moments where he will wound or maim one of his soldiers rather than killing them because he recognizes that just killing indiscriminately has less impact than, causing a wound that can be carried. And so he's set up very nicely. And at this point, we've got the four main plot lines, and they're all sort of set up. And we're at about halfway through the book, maybe a little less. I forget exactly where. I remember I was at like chapter 21, that of about like 44 or something like that. And I look up, and I think, and I realize, man, there's a massive tonal dissonance. And it feels a little overcrowded. Because the thing is, the three stories we already had before the plague and the ice tor flowers thing was introduced, that's already a pretty solid set of stories for a Redwall book. But they're all also pretty dark. And I don't think the book would work with one of them taken out, but the book could work with the ice tor flowers route taken out, except it would be a little dark. And Jake certainly does that later on, but I don't think he's willing to do that just yet. By the end of the book, it works beautifully. But at this sort of midway point, it feels overcrowded. It feels like there's too much happening. And the switching between perspective feels a little jarring at times. Because it sort of ends up like this. You've got the story at the mountain is a pretty grim war story. Hares die, and there are skirmishes back and forth, and there's parleys and duels and worries about supplies. The Mara and Pickles tale reads almost like a thriller at times, where there's dangers and there's existential threats, like the deep coiler in the lake. Their destination is an island in the middle of a great lake, where the Blackstone was lost. They need to find it again. And the deep coiler is a big sea serpent that lives in the lake and will, wreck boats and eat shrews and is generally very bad news. And so that's, one big threat. And there's this constant feeling of looming dread almost over Mara and Pickle's story. Or at least for a good portion of it. And then, because there's a good several chapters spent on the lake, because it's a big lake. All fresh water, though, so it's not, an inland sea or whatever. And then Sam Kim and Arula's story is I'd say it runs almost like a fairy tale. In some ways, it actually reminds me of Mattimeo, in that you've got the sort of constant push and pull of the chase as they try and go against the fox who is leading the trackers, the who stole the sword. Um, and so they end up meeting. They meet some shrews, and they team up with the shrews to go chase the fox and his group, because the fox killed some of the shrews. uh that's a big deal. And the whole that and it feels at times almost like a fairy tale, where you've got these repeated meetings until it finally works out, and they eventually make it to. I'll wrap up each story in turn. But you've got these sort of fairly dark and serious, not quite, not dark in most cases, but definitely serious and more somber storylines. And then you've got Uncle Thrug and his boy Dumble, well, on their way up to the far north. And look, they got a bird friend and named Recagnus, and his dad's here with the other falcons. And they're fighting the crows, and they're fighting foxes, and it's a it's a whole, like, it's all it read. I think I described it as, it reads almost like a Saturday morning cartoon. It feels so. It felt really tonally different, and by the end of the story, it works because Jake's, in the later chapters, manages to weave it in seamlessly. But there's a couple places where it's rough. And I think I can actually compare it to Mossflower in some respects. Mossflower was consistently pretty good, but had like one place where it stumbled. This had a few small issues, but for the most part was really good. And I think its overall quality was higher than Mossflower's, especially since, unless you count Dumble, none of the main characters are mice. Um, well, I guess unless you count the all the mice at the Abbey, but Mara's a badger, Pickle's a hare, Sam Kim is a squirrel, Arula is a mole, Thrug's an otter, and the badger or Earthstripe and all the hares Salamandastron are a badger and hares. And so you've got a lot of shrews, some of which are actually pretty important. Um, Tubgut, Alpho, Logalog, and Nordo being it's either Nordo or Noldo, I forget which, being sort of the most important. Um, Spriggett is pretty important, and he's a hedgehog. Um, and so that's I mentioned that's like one of the two big issues are, one, exposition, and two, that tonal dissonance that occurs at a few points, where you go from something very serious to something like almost cartoonish, or from something that's rather silly to something that's actually kind of serious. Um, and so those are really the only two big complaints I have. Anything else I think would really be nitpicking. The stories wrap up really well, and this is where I can really start to layer on the compliments. I'll go one story at a time. Um, the battle at the mountain is a constant back and forth. The mountain is an impregnable fortress, but Farron is very cunning. There's a bit of conflict between Farron and, no, not Farron, Farago and Klitsch. Farron's a different character we'll get to in just a second. Um, I actually think there are a lot of parallels to Clooney's Siege of Redwall. Uh, Farago uses a few tactics that mimic or resemble, but they don't feel like out of place or reused. They feel very natural. And I think that's very impressive. There are also some new tactics. So, Farron is a poisoner who is sent in to poison the water and the food of Salamandastron. And he's a very good poisoner, and he's a fox with like um, like pitch black hair, and he's actually rather like Shadow from Redwall, an operative sent in for a secret mission who meets a rather grisly end. Um, but where Shadow felt wasted, Farron gets enough time that we actually get a bit of a feel for him. And so his death feels both appropriate and doesn't come out of the blue. If he feels like he has used enough. Um, his death actually occurs off screen and then is revealed when one of Farago's other plots goes very poorly wrong. Farago, once he's figured out that the poisoning hasn't quite worked and Farron hasn't come back, decides to tunnel through the kitchen drain. And he comes up in the kitchen and he takes his knife and he goes to slit the throat of the creature standing in front of who was standing in the kitchen, and Farron's corpse falls down. And then he looks up, and there's Earthstripe with a big cauldron of hot boiling water, and he pours it down into the tunnel, which is almost direct quote from Redwall, but it's done so well, and the aftermath is handled differently, and so it feels like a very different battle because it is. Um, and the whole thing's handled well. When Farago is wounded, not killed, but he's badly wounded by the water, or by the boiling water. Um, there's rumor of mutiny because they've had repeated failures, and Farago promised that they'd be, in the mountain by now. And so Farago has a cunning plan, and he switches places with one of his officers when he's supposed to be sleeping, and the officer gets killed instead of him. Meanwhile, Klitsch has taken command and manages to capture a couple of the hares. And one of them, but the hares escape, and one of them, drifts off to sea on a bit of driftwood, and the other one runs around. Lieutenant Big Oxeye runs around the back of the mountain, and climbs back up. Farron was successful in poisoning all the food, and one of the hares dies of that. Another one, Farron stabs before anything can be done. And so Farron takes two hares out before being hunted down very methodically and dealt with. The siege continues pretty much until racked with grief at the loss of several important hares, Earthstripe charges out of the mountain to attack to challenge Farago and Klitsch to single combat. They, of course, are dishonorable creatures and hide a group of vermin to stab him in the back. And Earthstripe is very difficult to take down, and he manages to kill many vermin, and the hares run out to drag the very wounded badger back inside. And then start fighting a defensive action as the vermin start flooding through the gate they had to open to get Earthstripe inside. To get Earthstripe in. And that defensive action lasts until all the rest of the characters show up for the final battle to provide reinforcements. And how that happens, well, Mara and Pickle eventually get to the island, and they find the Blackstone, and they find that the Blackstone is being kept by Earthstripe's brother and grandmother, along with some squirrel that lives with them. and they manage to convince them to come along on the quest. Um, and in the meantime, Samkim and Arula and Spriggets and the Shrews are all, zooming down, chasing Deathbrush the Fox and Farago's trackers, and they catch them as they enter the Great Lake. And Samkin jumps aboard the vermin boat and battles Deathbrush, and he gets himself killed, but he manages to disarm the fox, and the fox falls into the water and is suddenly eaten by the Death Coiler. And the Death Coiler wrecks one of the boats, and Samkin's thrown into the water, but he manages to hold on to the Sword of Martin. And there's a great battle, and everyone's thrown about, and the Deep Coiler bites Sprigget, and Samkim stabs the Deep Coiler in the head, but he loses grasp of the Sword of Martin, and the Deep Coiler swims away. And Sprigget is wounded, and he ends up dying, and Samkim takes the sword, and Samkim has lost the sword, and it's all looking rather dire. Especially since the boats are in very bad condition because of the Deep Coiler's attack, and they lost several shrews. The next morning, as Mara and Pickle and the shrews at the island are packing up to leave, they find the Deep Coiler as a corpse on the beach, and they find the Sword of Martin, though none of them recognize it, of course, stuck in its head, and so they take that with them. And as they're going across the lake to make their way to Salamandastron, now that the Blackstone's been recovered, and they're now accompanied by Lomebud, the Grandma Badger, Earthwhite, Earthstripe's brother, the one without stripes, and Ashton the squirrel, they end up hearing a distress call from the other shrews. And they find the boats, and they find that these two shrew groups are like, they're like cousins. And so they work together, and they get the boats fixed up real quick, and everyone's happy. And Mara and Samkim, Spirit of Martin intervenes, and Mara ends up giving Sword of Martin back to Samkin, and it's pretty clear at this point, if it wasn't already, that Mara's meant to fill that empty Badger chair back at Redwall. And so now the group, which has been the culmination of these two lines, sail all the way out to Salamandastron, just in time to save the remaining hares in the battle. And Farago ends up dying to Earthstripe. The Earthstripe dies in the process as he succumbs to his wounds. Earthwhite manages to see his brother briefly, and then is made Lord of Salamandastron. And there's a great battle. Klitsch manages to sort of survive, but then he ends up dying to some of the water that Farron poisoned. And then it's implied that there's several days where they're just like clearing out the dead and making repairs. And Arula, being a mole, manages to find a spring hidden behind some rocks in the basement. And that makes Salamandastron essentially siege-proof. And it's one of the amusing little twists. This whole time, Farago's been, talking about the treasure of Salamandastron and how he's going to get it. And all the hares, and the badger, and Mara, and it's like everyone's saying, but there isn't any treasure in Salamandastron. It's all like weapons. But then right at the end, there's this reveal as one of Jake's little riddles. they rotate the throne of Lord Brocktree, the Great Badger Lord of Salamandastron, and it's revealed that there's a whole hoard of pearls and gold and necklaces and all those sorts of wonderful treasures, and that's where they bury um, Earthstripe so that he can guard it. Um, and then they start, and then the Shrews and Mara, the Shrews and Samkin and Arula start making their way back to Salamandastron with Mara and Pickle in tow. And since Samkin has invited Mara to be the Abbey Batcher, and of course Samkin is, her great her boon companion, and of course follows her, and so he's of course ends up as the Abbey's resident heir, and that's just that's almost where it ends, except that we need to return to Thrug and Dumble, and I know this recording is going on a while. I can already feel it. Wow. Um, Thrug and Dumble's story. Well, they meet. They end up. They have a whole bunch of adventures. They fight some foxes, and they find a wounded falcon and help patch him up. And the falcon joins them. Um, they end up ambushed by crows, and the falcon's dad and friends show up to fight the crows, and then the falcons and Thrug and Dumble all make their way up to the mountains, where it's very cold. Um, and Thrug's rather annoyed at the cold, but he starts looking for the flowers, and the Falcon dad says, "Oh no!" They all speak in a very very strong Highland brogue, and the the Falcon says, "Oh no, the ice dwarf flowers only grow next to the nest of Auld King the Auld Wild King MacPherson." And that really is the best name in the book, Wild King MacPherson. Love it. And MacPherson is known for having a very bad mood, and so, um, you know, Thrug is warned, it's not really a good idea to go up there. What you're going to do if he doesn't give you the flowers, just straight up. And Thrug sort of rolls up his sleeves and says, "I'll fight him." And of course, MacPherson is a golden eagle. Thrug's an otter. There's a bit of a size difference there. And so, the Falcon Dad basically says, anyone with guts like that can go up there. Sure, try it. And so Thrug makes the long and arduous climb with Dumble still in the haversack on his back. And then they get up there, and Thrug attempts to bargain with MacPherson. MacPherson's not really impressed. And MacPherson goes, "Why shouldn't I just eat you right now?" And then Dumble pops out of the backpack and goes, "'Cause I'll fight you." And the eagle looks at Dumble and goes, "Oh no, a mouse! Ah, spare me. Have some flowers. I'll carry you back home." Um, and so we have this wonderful, wonderful chapter with Dumble flying in between the eagle talons in a haversack filled with the ice tor flowers, which we never really get a good description of, sadly. I wish we did. And that manages to save the Abbey, as everyone, including the Abbess now, has come down with this, terrible fever. But everyone's, all red as rain very quickly. And then it takes a good while for Thrug to get back, because he just decides to, go by foot and take the long route. And he ends up coming back with a big feather in a big hat, and looking all like a great roguish adventurer. And I would love to have a book just of Thrug's adventures. But the season wears on, um, and Abbas Vale has refused to like name the season because she's waiting for the for Samkim and Arula to be back because she's pretty sure they'll be back. And one plot point I haven't talked about because she really was underutilized, I think, was is Sister Nasturtium. Nasturtium um, basically keeps getting like songs sent to her by Martin the Warrior, and she doesn't know what she's singing when she sings them, and nobody really bothers to write them down. Um, but of course, as the readers, we can analyze them and see that they, predict the next chunk of the story quite accurately. And I feel that we didn't really get enough of her. Uh, there were a couple of Mattimeo. I mentioned Sister May was a highlight character. Um, I feel like Nasturtium could have been on the level of Sister May, but unfortunately she wasn't, and that rather saddens me. Um, but I don't think I can compliment this book enough. There are, all the characters feel really well rounded with the exception of Fergal. And there are times when Arula and Dumble feel a little similar, but really it's not that big a deal. Um, Especially since it's implied in the epilogue that they're actually, pretty close. Um, you know, like Dumble's considered an uncle, generally. Um, and it ends with the heroes returning home and a great feast and just generally good cheer. And I'm really happy I read Salamandastron. uh it's definitely top of the line. It's not a perfect book by any means, no book is, but it is the best Redwall book I've read so far. And I looked forward to reading Martin the Warrior in the coming week or two. So thank you for sitting through this rambly talk. Um, Go check out Wholesome Bookworm when you have the time. I'll try to remember to link his channel in the description. Um, but have a good day, and until next time, friends. Eulalia.